Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Design Thinking 101. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. So just so you guys know, all callers will be muted. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat. You should see it on the left-hand side of your screen. And we will keep track of your questions throughout, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. If you lose your internet connection, you'll want to reconnect using the link that was emailed to you. You might want to refresh your browser just in case you drop off. For upcoming and past webinars, we will host them on our website, TechSoup.org/community/events-webinars. If you want to watch this webinar again in the future, or if you have to drop off early today, we will be hosting the webinar on our website. You'll also receive an email once the webinar is over with the presentation and a link to the recording. If you're on social media, feel free to tweet at us at TechSoup using hashtag #TSWebinars. But like I said earlier, we will be monitoring the Q&A that's on the left-hand side. So just a little bit about TechSoup. We are in 236 countries and territories. We serve over 1 million nonprofits, and we work with several technology partners to provide either donated or discounted hardware and software. Some of our partners include Adobe, AWS, Intuit, Microsoft, Symantec, and several more, as you can see here on this list. And if you are curious about exploring our nonprofit tech marketplace, there's a link at the bottom, TechSoup.org/get-product-donations, where you can browse what products are available to you and to your nonprofit. So just before we get started, I want to make sure the chat box works. So if you guys want to type in where you guys are calling in from, and I can read out a few of them. All right, so we have Bend, Oregon, and Folly Theater. Let's see, Chicago, St. Paul, Florence, Oregon. Okay, cool. So it looks like the chat function is working. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. So today we have with us Glenn Fajardo. So Glenn Fajardo is the Director of the Co-Design Practice of the TechSoup Global Network. And just so you guys know, yesterday was his 11th anniversary at TechSoup, so feel free to wish him a happy anniversary in the chat box. He has worked with NGO partners around the world to build and expand programs and partnerships. Glenn also teaches at Stanford University Design School, and most recently Design Across Borders in spring 2018. He's also formally trained in nuclear engineering sciences and public policy. And in addition to all of these talents, he also plays electric bass and likes to cook in other people's kitchens. So if you guys have a kitchen available, let him know in the chat box. My name is Seema Tucker. I'm the online learning producer here at TechSoup. And we also have Lashika Phillips, and she is helping out on the back end. You've probably seen her name. And she'll be helping out if you have any technical problems. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Glenn.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and super excited to be here. We'll go ahead and start with a question. We want to know, is your organization currently leveraging design thinking? Yes or no? So we'll go ahead and fill that out. And as folks are filling that out, I'm really excited to be sharing this hour with you today. And we'll talk about what design thinking is and what kind of how it works, and some common misconceptions about it and how you can get started. So we'll go ahead and go to the results. All right. So we have a few folks, like about 11% of folks who are currently using design thinking, and 88% of folks who are not, which is great. This is an introduction, and that is very helpful. So design thinking, question mark. What are we talking about? So for today, in this webinar, what you can expect is some exposure to some basic concepts and a little bit of Q&A. Today, over the next hour, we won't be able to get any practice or reflection or feedback or coaching. I mention these because if you'd like to learn design thinking, it's really something that's an experiential activity. It's something that you have to kind of do to learn. It's kind of like learning how to ride a bike. So But you can by the end of this webinar, you'll have an understanding of what design thinking is and whether it's something that you might want to look into further if it's of interest to you. I teach in addition to my work in TechSoup, I teach at the Stanford D School. This is a picture of my most recent class where we had half of our participants at Stanford and others that were split primarily with Mexico City, Peru, Venezuela, and other places. So we're looking at how to use design thinking in ways that can stretch the globe, which is really exciting. And the class is called Design Across Borders. So what is design thinking? Here's one way to think of it. Design thinking can be a powerful approach that helps organizations expand their horizons of what is possible. The idea of what we're trying to do is to create deep empathy and get us out of the abstract debate over ideas in meeting rooms to a place where we can collaboratively create and test tangible concepts faster. Okay, so this is a lot of words, but I think if you think about a time where it felt like you were talking about an idea or a concept for months and months and like nothing happened, like that's something where design thinking kind of, instead of talking about it for a long time, we try to get out and talk to people, and we try to get out and build things faster so we can learn faster by making them tangible. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. If you're curious about examples for how nonprofits have used design thinking, one example that I particularly like, and there's an article in the Harvard Business Review about this. The article is called "What Design Thinking is Doing for the San Francisco Opera." And the San Francisco Opera is it's an interesting institution. I live in San Francisco myself, and a lot of operas are kind of funded by like more of a patronage model of like people who are like very rich people funding and the institution of opera. And in San Francisco, it's a little bit more of I guess we're more of like a grassroots kind of culture in some kinds of ways. And they were looking at how to make the opera more accessible to a larger part of the population. And if you read this case study, which is a really interesting one, it talks about how they took an institution that had this culture of perfectionism, that would always not put anything out until it was completely perfect, and be able to try things faster by using design thinking. They mentioned things like how they went out to the public and just literally stood on the sidewalk and kind of simulated a new experience with the opera, where they like kind of role played the whole thing. They just pretended to have like doors that were opening, and then they had these different stations that people would go to that were simulated by just looking at an iPad. It's a really cool story that I encourage you to check out online if you're interested in looking at an in-depth case study, and how they got close to users, how they prototyped new things, how they tried this thing called before opening a new facility. They did a kind of a pop-up version of it in a bar, which is really like not something you'd expect from an opera, but it's a really interesting case study of like how design thinking was used by an organization, and I encourage you to check it out. So if you've heard a little bit about design thinking, the typical image is like this big wall of Post-its, right? And Post-its are a great tool, but is design thinking just about Post-its? I would say that it's not. It's just one tool in the toolkit. Design thinking, if you've heard a little bit about it, you might have seen this process diagram where it has like this these different states, and people think that design thinking is like if you just follow these 4 or 5 steps, and then that's how design thinking works. Again, it's a useful kind of framework, but that's not really what is at the absolute core of design thinking. Krista Carter at the D School has this really good article too called "Let's Stop Talking About the Design Process," and she compares design thinking to how people learn how to cook. You kind of start with recipes, but when you learn how to cook, recipes are just your starting point, and eventually you get to the point where you're not having to follow directions on exact measurements, and instead you can kind of get the principles of it, and you can kind of practice it and create your own dishes over time. So design thinking is kind of like that as well, and this is also really good reading. And just to set expectations, in the next 50 minutes, we're not going to become master chefs in a single webinar, but we'll give you an exposure to some concepts. Okay, so is design thinking the solution to everything? Can I apply it to anything that I do? And I'd actually say the answer to this is no. Um, so what is design thinking good for? Design thinking is good for human subjective challenges. This is the way one of my colleagues at the D School phrases it. And let's take this picture and kind of draw a couple of examples of where design thinking is more useful and less useful. Like if the problem was in this picture, like what, like how should we engineer the concrete so it's a specific hardness so bicycles can go over it? That is probably not so much a human subjective challenge. It's more like a technical challenge. And there's probably like a right or wrong answer to that from a technical standpoint. But if we were designing like how can we create signage or paths so that bicyclists and pedestrians can share this roadway in a more pleasant way for everyone involved. That's a human subjective challenge that involves like human experience and how people feel. That's the kind of thing that design thinking is really very much useful for. So again, it's human subjective challenges is the area in which design thinking is most useful. Okay, so here's an overview of design thinking. In design thinking, we want to focus on the human need and how we might help meet that need. It's very, very centered on people's experiences and how people feel, and making sure that we're addressing their core needs from a emotional experience as well. So it's about talking a little bit less, and it's about listening and observing a little more to really understand the people that we're trying to serve. And it's about building a little bit more quickly and making things tangible so that we can learn. The picture that you see here is from a workshop that I did with some nonprofits in Southeast Asia in Kuala Lumpur. And the idea that they wanted to prototype was this idea of tech support for nonprofits that would be on the back of a moped that could go around the city and service nonprofits, particularly ones that had less bandwidth. And they had all sorts of really cool and interesting ideas. And as they talked about it, they said like, oh, we should just prototype it. And they put this prototype together like in, I think it was like 25 minutes. It was pretty quick. You can see it's just like the storage bin like with poster board, and they put in like exhaust pipes and a Wi-Fi router on the top. And what was interesting about this was in that 25-minute exercise of building, and then a debrief of it, like that was maybe about another 45 minutes to an hour. They learned so many things about like what would and wouldn't work just by making it a little bit more tangible, like and doing it very quickly. And that way you get to something that feels more closer to like what would actually happen in the real world versus talking about ideas in just through talking in meeting rooms and in conference rooms. So in design thinking, we think that doing is often the best form of learning. I used the analogy earlier of it's like learning how to ride a bike, or it's like learning how to swim, or it's like learning for those of you who know how to drive stick shift. It's kind of, I feel like that's a dying art these days, but it's learning how to drive stick shift. I was actually a lot older when I learned how to drive stick shift, and what's funny is it's one of those things where somebody can explain it to you. You could watch a YouTube video on it. You could read instructions, but you don't really get it until you actually do it yourself and you kind of see how it feels. And it's not just doing design thinking like in terms of learning how to do design thinking, but it's also just when you're trying to create better ways of doing things, you have to sort of try them in practice in order to see whether they really work or not. So it's about building to help others feel what a new experience might be like. And it's about getting feedback quickly so that we can iterate and improve quickly. So trying to work, instead of trying one thing, over the course of a year, we want to get to the point where we can try something like at least every month, if not like every 2 weeks or even every week, so that we can put it in front of people, get see how they actually react to it, and then be able to iterate and improve quickly. Okay, so these are the kind of 4 of the major mindsets of design thinking: empathize, define, ideate, and prototype. And I'll talk about these a little bit more in the remainder of the webinar, but I wanted to start with this question, which is which mindsets of design thinking are you familiar with? Building empathy, defining design challenges, ideation, which is kind of the broader term for brainstorming, and prototyping. So go ahead and fill that out, and that way we can get a little bit of a sense of what things are more familiar or less familiar. And great. And thank you, Jonathan, for the question. We will get to Q&A at the end. But and other folks, if you have questions that you want to want us to address in the Q&A, feel free to put them in at any time. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the results. Okay, great. Thanks folks for filling in this poll question. Looks like there is a fair amount of familiarity with ideation and brainstorming. Almost 80% of folks are familiar with that. About 40% on prototyping, and then less so on building empathy and defining design challenges. That's super helpful. I'll try to divide the time accordingly for the remainder of the webinar. Okay, great. So I want to talk about this idea of iteration, sort of trying something, seeing what happens, making adjustments, and then again, trying something, seeing what happens, making adjustments. What we're doing when we're iterating in design thinking is we're not only iterating on the solution. So what you see on the left is an image of the evolution of this product called Google Glass. Google Glass is its own kind of interesting story, but like you can see how it evolved. This sort of solution evolved from like a prototype that had like literally a cell phone on the side of somebody's head to these successive prototypes that got more and more refined as they got along until it got to a product. So this is an example of iterating on seeing the iteration of the solution and how it evolves over time. But in design thinking, we definitely do that. That's something that is a lot of folks know about. But we're also iterating how we see the problem. So we might start with one problem framing early on and think like here, the problem framing is this. The problem framing is that that policymakers just don't understand like that this particular policy is important, and we as an advocacy group need to get them to understand it. And as we try things, we may see that, oh, the problem is not that they don't understand it, but that they have political pressure from this particular group, and we need to be able to like address their need around that to be able to satisfy a certain set of their constituents. So in design thinking, it's not just about iterating on the solution, but we keep on refining our understanding of what the problem is or how we're framing the problem. And that's a really critical concept of design thinking. You can think of design thinking too as kind of this, you're always like diverging and converging. And it's sort of the successive thing where we try to create choices and widen our field of what we're looking at. And then we make some choices to kind of test them out. And then we learn from that, and then we create more choices. So it's another way of expressing this is kind of like focus and flaring. So you're constantly go wide, narrow down, test something, learn from it, then go wide again, and then keep on doing this kind of back and forth till you get to a point where you are at a degree of confidence that you're comfortable with. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the 4 mindsets that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The first one is empathizing. And this is really about understanding the world from another person's point of view and experiences. So what you see in this picture is I'm honestly forgetting like which country this is. I think it's Tanzania, where a group was trying to develop some services that were designed to serve the visually impaired, so people who are blind. And the way they went about their design process was for the people involved in the team to experience what it might be like to be blind and kind of to navigate a certain space. And so it was really about building empathy for how another person experiences the world. So what we're trying to do in building empathy is we're trying to get at what people actually do, not just what they say. So if you look at this photo, what do you think this person's problem is? So you can, you might be able to deduce that from having a fan underneath their computer. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Like it's their laptop cooling. Their laptop is overheating, and yeah, thank you, Jared, for that. Like yeah, so it's a laptop overheating issue. And this is the kind of thing that you probably would not necessarily catch in a survey, but just by watching like what happens, like in a person's environment, you can see like what's actually going on. And I agree with Tara that this is it's actually a pretty brilliant solution for what that solves their problem. And one thing that's really useful to look at when you're doing observations and trying to build empathy with folks is to kind of see what workarounds people have, because workarounds tell you about what somebody's really trying to accomplish, and you can kind of that's like it's a big kind of beacon that says, hey, look at this more closely, because it will tell you more about what their needs are and like how they're trying to go about satisfying it and how you might be able to improve things so to give them a better experience and really meet their needs. So let's look at another example. So if we look at this, what does it seem like this person's need is, or like what are they like? What is it that they're trying to do? Yes, simplify. Thank you, John, Tara, and Melissa, and Molly, and Rachel. And Lynn, they're looking for simplicity, and it's like the jitterbug of TV remotes. Love that. To cut out the clutter. And so again, this is kind of like an example of a workaround where you look at like this literally tells you what's important to people, like or this person, like what is it that they're really trying to accomplish, and like having all those other options is not only not helpful, but is like it's bothering them enough that they want to just cover everything else up. And so again, like if you just ask somebody like, how do you want me to change this remote, then they may not be able to kind of do this. But if you like watch what they actually do, then that's a little bit more telling of what their actual needs are. Okay, so it's often not as simple as asking people what they want. And because I get questions sometimes, they say like, oh, we do surveys, and like, isn't that kind of the same thing? And surveys are a super useful tool, and I do surveys myself, but this is a little bit different what we're talking about, this idea of doing observations and interviewing people, like talking to people. And the reason why it's different is, let's try to illustrate this through a story. So I believe I heard this through Malcolm Gladwell, who I'm sure got it from somebody else, but it's a story about like what Americans want in coffee, right? And so if you ask people like what they want in coffee, people in the U.S., often they'll say, I think it was something like in the story, it was like 80% of folks say, I want a dark, rich, hearty roast, right? And it sounds like straight from a coffee commercial, right? And so that's what they'll tell you. That's what they'll say that they want. But if you hang out at a Starbucks or any other cafe, and you look at hang out where the sugar and the cream and milk is, what you'll see is that most people, what they really want is milky, weak coffee, right? And so there's this disconnect between what people say that they want and what people actually do in practice. And in design thinking, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get at people's actual behaviors, and that's why we do these observations. And then when we do interviews, we are really trying to get at behaviors rather than asking people like speculative questions. So I'm not going to have time to go through this in a ton of detail, but this is the slide that you see here is some pointers that I have around formulating interview questions, and I'll just highlight a few of them. Number 3 is the idea of focusing on actual experiences. Don't ask hypotheticals. So instead of saying, "Hey, do you usually put half and half in your coffee?" Like usually it's kind of like it's feeling a little bit of hypothetical. But if I ask you, this morning when you're at Starbucks, tell me about like what you did. And so when you focus on sort of concrete actual experiences, you're getting closer to what people do in practice versus what they think they do. And this is not to say that people are stupid or people people are. It's just human psychology. Like our minds kind of work differently when people ask us these questions of like, what do you usually do, or what would you like to do? There's all these kinds of ways in which I think that, the number one thing is we often tell people what we think they want to hear. But if you focus on actual experiences, you get a more kind of objective or closer to objective view of like what's actually happening. Same point on number 4 about asking about specific instances. Don't say usually. And the other one I'll highlight is number 7, which is to dig deeper and keep asking why. Keep saying, "Tell me more." This is a really interesting practice. We have this thing that we draw from called 5 Whys, which is I think it was originally from probably some like Japanese quality management thing, but it's the idea of like you hear an answer to something and then you ask why again, and then kind of dig a little bit deeper, and then train yourself to ask why like at least 5 times in a row. Now you don't want to sound like a 6-year-old when you're doing this. You don't want to be like why? No, that's just kind of annoying. But there's some kind of more artful ways of phrasing this. But the core idea here is to keep on digging beyond the surface and just be really curious. And when you ask why, it's not that you're trying to like play this game of gotcha with people, but you're just really curious to deeply understand like a person's experience and like what's going through their mind as they're doing something. With my students, I often have them practice 5 Whys by doing it with all their friends and family, like for a week. This is probably a longer topic, but the thing that I want you to come away with here is in design thinking, what we're trying to do is we're constantly trying to dig deeper to get a deeper understanding of what's going on. Okay, so that was on building empathy. Let's talk about defining. And when we say defining, we're talking about defining problem statements, or the way I like to think of it is like opportunity statements. It's trying to come up with a statement of a design challenge that we can effectively act on. And we use the phrasing, how might we, which some of you might be familiar with, but we usually lead our questions with like, how might we, blank, 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 blank. And we want to make design challenges that are really centered around people's human needs versus like a technical solution. I'll go through an example that kind of goes through this, but we want to have a sense of possibility. We want to make sure that it's kind of the framing is optimistic, that it's the kind of thing that we can actually address. We want it to be broad enough that there's a wide range of solutions. If there's only one solution possible, and we know that up front, then design thinking is probably not the thing that you want to be doing for that particular situation. But we want it to be narrow enough to provide some useful boundaries. So these provide some principles, but let's go through a concrete example just to give you a sense of like how these play out in practice. So this is an example of developing a how might we design challenge, and this is from the book Creative Confidence from Tom and David Kelly. Really great book. Highly recommend it if you're interested in learning more about design thinking, creative confidence. So the original problem that they describe in this example is that staff do not get expense reports in on time. And we all work for organizations, and for many of us, maybe yourself, like it's kind of a familiar issue of like people don't get their expense reports in on time, and like what can we do about this? And this is Tom and David talk about this in a very, they're talking about one specific organization that they were working with. So if we frame the design challenge like this, how might we get people to be more timely with their expense reporting? This doesn't really get us any farther down the road. It's just kind of restating the starting problem. So how can we tweak this a little bit so we're getting closer to something that is human-centered that we can act on, and the other things that I mentioned. Now, if we used a framing like how might we use a smartphone app to speed up expense reporting, like this framing is too narrow. And the problem here is that we've basically written the solution into the problem statement. Like we said basically the only way to solve this is to use a smartphone app. And that might not be really like what you want to you might want to do. Like it might be like that a smartphone app is a great solution. It might be that that's a terrible solution if your original problem framing was more just about how to get people to submit their expense reports more on time. Now if we framed it this way and we said how might we get people to have more respect for deadlines? Good luck with that. Like that's kind of like that's kind of way too big. That's kind of like saying like how can we get people to be good people? Like that's it's not something that you can really act on. So that's an example of a framing that's too broad. So what in this example that Tom and David talk about, the specific challenge in the specific context that they came up with was how might we simplify the expense reporting process so that people can complete it more quickly. So this is something that is human-centered. It's about, again, coming back to this need for simplicity. It's specific to the situation, and it's the kind of thing that is broad enough that it could invite a range of solutions, but it's narrow enough that we can actually act on it. So that's an example of defining challenges. Defining challenges is one of, I've found from the students that I've taught and people that I've taught, NGOs I've taught around the world on design thinking, defining design challenges is like to me it's like one of the hardest parts of design thinking, like really getting at the correct problem framing. It takes practice. And so it's the kind of thing like if you don't feel like you're getting it right away, that's totally natural. You just have to keep on practicing it and keep testing it against those criteria of is it human-centered, is it narrow enough, is it broad enough? Okay, great. So I'm going to quickly go through the next two sections because it sounds like people are a little bit more familiar with these things. Ideation is about the idea of or the practice of generating a lot of ideas before locking into one thing. So the photo that you see here is some brainstorming actually done in TechSoup, and this is from our summer interns. I do a workshop with them every year, and this was actually from last year. And I was teaching them some more advanced brainstorming techniques. This is called Creative Matrix, and I'm not going to go into that today, but it's a really great technique for expanding your brainstorming. So in ideation and brainstorming, we want to go wide first. We don't want to get too invested in the first idea, and we want to explore different concepts before deciding. Conceptually, I think this sounds pretty like, oh yeah, of course we want to do this. But if you think about how decisions are made in the workplace and like what happens in your work, like a lot of times we lock into the first thing that people say, or we lock into the first thing that the big boss says, right? And so like ideation and brainstorming is a way for us to kind of not get locked into the first thing and consider a wide variety of things that we might consider trying out. So sorry, slide. Okay. Brainstorming rules. Again, it sounds like a lot of folks have done brainstorming before, but it's about getting as many ideas out as possible. and there's no judgment in this phase. It's really just about like idea generation and doing it relatively quickly. Cool. And then so let's go ahead to prototyping, which is the last mindset that I'll cover today. Prototyping is really about simple simulations of new experiences and making it tangible, the things I talked about in the opening. It's about creating things that are concrete enough to force realistic thinking about how the user would interact with your idea. The user, the person that you're trying to serve, would interact with your idea. We want it to be as quick and cheap as possible so that we can try things out quickly and get feedback quickly. So some prototype examples. I'm not going to show the video today, but if you look up on YouTube, prototyping for Elmo's Monster Maker iPhone app, you'll see like what you can do with a piece of cardboard. So long story short, what happens is there's a design team that was working with the people who I forgot what the parent company for Elmo is, whoever does like Sesame Street. And they're trying to explain like what this app would do, or like what like how it would work. And they were kind of going round and round on this. And then the design team said, "Oh wait, why don't we just prototype it?" So they just took a piece of cardboard and they kind of acted it out, and then you could really see very quickly how the app would work in practice. So check out this video on YouTube. Again, prototyping Elmo's Monster Maker app. You should be able to find it pretty quickly. But again, like it just took them 30 minutes to build that prototype, and it advanced the team's understanding of the problem and the solution a lot quicker. Okay. This is another example of what you see on the right is kind of the final product. This is a surgery tool. And early on, when they were developing this, they were working with a team of surgeons, and then several of them described like, oh, we want something that's kind of like sort of in the shape of like a gun. And somebody said, oh, can you show us what that looks like? And then with a dry erase marker, a clothespin, and for those of you old enough to remember, a film cartridge when we had film. They put something together that they could kind of touch and can kind of kick around and say like, hey, this is what it looks like. So this is another example of making it more tangible. And obviously they didn't go straight from the thing on the left to the thing on the right, but what they did on the left was very early on and be able to kind of zero in on like what's kind of a space that we can explore that this kind of something like this. Another example of prototyping is Kickstarter campaigns, and people think of Kickstarter campaigns as like a way to raise money to do something, which is obviously that's what Kickstarter is designed to do. But you can also think of Kickstarter and kind of change your attitude towards it and say, hey, let's just throw this idea out there, and then if people fund it, then we'll go ahead and put the effort in to build it out. And if people don't fund it, then we're not going to spend all that time and money to do that. So doing whether it's Kickstarter or other crowdfunding platforms, they're not just a means of getting funding, but they're also a means of testing ideas and seeing which have traction and which could attract support. And then a couple of quick other examples. This is from a workshop that I did with NGOs in Maputo, Mozambique. And believe it or not, this is a prototype of blended online learning for NGOs. And so what you see on the right is kind of a prototype of the online experience, and what you see on the left is a prototype of the part of the course that would be in person. And so they were able to kind of build this model and kind of act out like this is what would happen. And it was very kind of funky and playful, and I felt like a 7-year-old in a good way. Of course, we were like literally like playing pretend. But it surfaced these things. We're like, oh, when this part happens, like we have to think about this, or when this part happens, this transition is going to be really confusing, or this is going to be, here are other things that we need to figure out. And yeah, Margarita, you're absolutely right. It's a lot of fun to do this, and it's not that hard, and doesn't have to be expensive. Like these are things. I mean, you can see the materials in here. This is like made out of like like paper, and I think we had a little bit of string, and then we got some clay. I mean, clay's not, or you can use Play-Doh. Play-Doh's great. Like that's toothpicks, you know. But it's amazing like what kinds of things you can do to make an idea tangible, and to be able to kind of walk through how it might work in practice. This last example, this is, believe it or not, this is a prototype of a conference. And this is from a workshop that I did with our office in Warsaw, Poland. And so they were trying to figure out how the flow of this event would work. And this is a not a huge event, but this is probably like a 400 or 500 person event. And by just making these models and be able to sort of tell a story around it and be able to say like, oh, this is how it might work, they were able to surface all these things about like what they had to kind of build out in more detail, or what kinds of things that they had to, or the really great opportunities from this conference, things that they didn't expect, and like what else they need to flesh out in more detail. So the point of all these prototypes is we want to use prototypes, and as we test prototypes with our users, we want to really find the part that customers are really excited about. And I think there's an analogous lesson from startups. Most startups, they die not because of their operations are bad, or the plenty of startups that have problems with operations, but most of them die from a lack of customers. Like nobody wants what they're building. And so I think for us as nonprofits, like we also have to think about, does anybody actually want what we're creating? And so by prototyping things and testing them quickly, we're able to get a better sense of what people actually want. So it's really important to try multiple options. Don't get locked into the first idea. And trial and error involves error. Right? This is really hard for us in the nonprofit field, because we're just like, oh my God, like if we try something that doesn't work, people are going to die. And in some cases that's true. But a lot of times we're really overstating that. And we don't do ourselves a favor, we don't do the people that we serve a favor by using this as an excuse all the time. So we really want to scope things where we're able to, try things out quickly and try things out in a way that doesn't create so much risk that people actually are going to die. But there's ways that we can structure our experiments and our explorations in ways that allow us to make these errors that kind of advance our understanding and that help us do bigger and better things. One real quick note, like when you're presenting prototypes to folks or having people experience them, what I call "I love it, do you love it" is a really dangerous approach. Like when you're testing prototypes with people, like it's important not to build your own biases into it. So don't confuse what you think of your product with what customers think of your product, or your constituents or the people that you serve, what they think of your product. And so the example that I use is what I call the date test, right? So if I went to somebody and I asked them, would you date somebody who is good looking, really smart, and wants to make the world a better place? And then the person says yes. Then I would say, oh, that means you would date me, right? So it's kind of like I'm confusing what I think of the product, what I think of myself, versus what the other person thinks of it. So the more proper test would be to say, would you date me? And then like that actually gets you more towards like what the person actually thinks of that particular interaction. So again, don't confuse what you think of what you're building with what your user, your customer, your constituent, the people that you serve think about it. Do people really want what you have to offer? So some prototype forms, we have models, storyboards, even just like role play is a really great way to prototype things, to kind of act like out how a program might work, and diagrams, and there's a bunch of others. So to conclude real quickly, some resources to get started. If you're interested in learning more about design thinking, trying things out, one thing to check out is this is on the Stanford D-School website. It's called A Virtual Crash Course in Design Thinking, and it has this kind of like self-contained course that you can do with a group on trying out trying out design thinking. Another resource. This is on. Actually, I didn't do the the screenshot very well here, but this is from LinkedIn Learning. There's a class called Learning Design Thinking: Lead Change in Your Organization that I really like. It's by Terry McKinley at Frog Design. LinkedIn Learning is a paid service, but pro tip: if you haven't used it already, there's a 1-month free trial, and so you can totally take the class for free, like if you wanted to. And I actually I really like this particular course. I think it's a good one. Another one is this is on Plus Acumen. And so Plus Acumen did a course with IDEO.org around an introduction to human-centered design. So in this class, you do this with a group as well. It's more of like a kind of a self-paced thing. And I did this course. It's generally a good course. The one caveat I give on this one is that it really depends on like the group that you work with, the group of people that you work with. It's because it's kind of more learner-led. If you're in a good group, it works really well. It's a little harder if it really just depends on like how your group is composed. But it's worth checking out. And this class is free. Another free class. This is on Coursera. This is Gene Litka's class. Gene's really great. Like this class is called Design Thinking for the Greater Good. Innovation in the social sector. I think this class is if you're the kind of person who likes to have a lot of like detailed lecture. I think this is this is a class that has a lot of that, which is really great for some people. But I think it's a little bit I'd say it's a little bit heavy on that side. I think in general, like when you're learning. Design thinking is something that you learn by doing, and really like if the best way to learn it is to try things, really reflect on them and learn from them. And if you can get feedback and coaching from people who are a little bit more experienced than you or a lot more experienced than you, that's really the ideal way so far to learn design thinking and learn how to do it well. That's why people will go to in-person courses, and there's a program at the D School called Designing for Social Systems, which is a really great program. And those are a lot more expensive, but really what you're in a lot of cases what you're paying for is really the feedback and coaching part of it. But that's a super valuable part to really advance your practice, and it can be for some if you have the available resources, it can be a really great investment of time. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time, and we'll go to Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. That was super informative. If you guys have questions, now is the time to use the chat box to ask those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have about 11 minutes, so we have a few questions that have come in. So Glenn, are there any tactics or recommendations on getting introverts and or risk-averse folks to engage in design thinking sessions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, and it's interesting because we in the D School teaching community, we talk about this topic a lot. We actually had like one of our teaching community sessions was entirely around the subject of introverts. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think it's a little bit. Let me give a concrete example of one way in which you can kind of tweak things to kind of help introverts. So when we're doing brainstorming, a lot like one technique is you write ideas and as you write down ideas, you put them on the board and you read them out loud so other people can do it. And what a lot of folks have found is like actually what you want to do is instead of like jumping straight into that, which is a process that kind of is easier for extroverts, maybe what you can do instead is have people write down 5 ideas first. And then after people have written down 5 ideas, then you start reading them out loud. So it's really about structuring things so it doesn't require like introverts to like really necessarily jump out, or maybe something where you call on people, or something where you take turns. There's all these kinds of strategies that you can use to involve introverts. But it's a great question. It's something that we have to kind of tweak like how we do things to make sure that we are being inclusive of introverts.
Perfect. I think this is a nice segue to the next question. So Margarita, who's on her first TechSoup webinar, she's asking if her contacts are mostly virtual, can she still implement design thinking, and how can she get people who are in remote locations to be involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is actually my one of the areas of this is actually part of my professional focus, is understanding like how people can do design thinking when they're far apart. And my specific interest is around like how they can do design thinking together when they're far apart and in different cultural contexts. I work with NGOs in different places, and there's a longer story behind this, but the short answer to this probably is like I believe it's possible, and I'm helping build methods that make it easier and more accessible and more possible for people to do that. I'm happy to talk to you about that in more detail, Margarita. Like if you drop me an email, perhaps we can have a longer conversation around it. But I think we're kind of sort of virtual collaboration and people being able to be creative together when they're far apart in geographically distributed teams. This is like one of the current frontiers of design thinking and of like teams and innovation in general. But I think it's possible. I'm actively working on this problem quite a bit myself. Happy to talk to you more, Margarita, in detail about it.
Great, and we'll chat out Glenn's email for everyone in case you have questions after the webinar. So I have another question for you. I guess it's kind of a two-part question. So for everyone that's on this webinar, when they walk away today, is there a particular area that nonprofits kind of can get started right away with design thinking? Like, is there a specific space that's best to get started? So that's the first part.
Okay. Is there a specific space to get started? I think the trick is I would come back to like what is sort of like a human subjective challenge that you have, and you want to pick something that is, for your first project, you want to take something that is like consequential, that is important enough that people are going to pay attention to it, but you don't want it to be so consequential or so like high priority that people get very risk averse with it, right? So you want to take like one thing to target that Thomas Both at the D School has this kind of trick that he describes, which I think Thomas is really great. Like he said, like, pick the thing that nobody wants to do. Pick that thing that everybody knows is important, but like everybody's just like, oh man, it just gives me a headache starting to think about that. But the thing that if you were able to, you and your colleagues were able to address it, you'd be a hero for solving it. So I think that's kind of the main things I would emphasize is like start with make sure that you're picking something that's like a human subjective challenge. Don't make sure you're not picking like a very like technical problem. And the second thing is try to pick something that is that has really high upside, but that isn't like the most important project of the organization. Because the problem with taking the most important project of the organization is that everybody is going to be kind of wigged out by it, right? So you want to. I know this is kind of like an answer, kind of an artful answer that doesn't give you something super specific, but that's generally what I would aim for. Human and subjective challenge, something that is important but not so like the highest priority of the organization.
Perfect. The second part to this question, so Tara, who's in our audience today, she was asking, how can I apply this approach to a discussion about organizing company-wide data, and is that possible?
Yeah. So applying design thinking to company-wide discussion on how you use data, totally possible. And I think the way to one way to start with it is to say like, how do people again, let's come back to what's the subjective human experience behind this. It's not so much the data itself; it's how people use the data. So one way to kind of use design thinking in a company-wide discussion of data is to get at like what are people trying to accomplish? What are all the different uses of the data? Like what are people trying to, what are the different human problems that exist in different parts of the organization where they, they're having trouble with their job because they don't have the information that they need. And then just so even just making talking to people in the organization about that, making a list of like what are the various ways in which, what are the various like information gaps that people have. That's one way to get started with design thinking in a company-wide discussion of data.
Perfect. Okay, and we have one last question from Jonathan. He's been actively participating in the conversation, so thanks, Jonathan. If you find you end up having deviations on the audience, do you break that into two separate design thinking tracks? Do you break up the groups if there are differences that are tough to solve for together?
Yeah, there's that's an interesting question. Like I think you can. It really depends on the specific situation, Jonathan. It's a really good question. There are some situations where I would break up teams into creating like contrasting prototypes, for example, to have like if people feel a lot of energy around one thing and a group of people feels energy around one thing and another group of people feels energy around another thing. I know, Jonathan, this isn't like a black and white answer, but like it really depends on the context because sometimes when you break up groups and you have them creating contrasting prototypes, they tend to kind of compete with each other in a way that's not helpful. Like they try to convince people that their prototype is or their solution is right. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll mix people up a little bit, like so that two different prototypes can be explored, but in each team that we have a mix of folks who will really kind of probe and ask and things like that. But it's really, Jonathan, you've kind of hit on like an important dynamic in design thinking is like we always have to kind of protect against our bias to try to prove ourselves right? And then so this is what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, like in our lives, right? So when we prototype, we have to make sure that we're framing it in a way that the purpose of these things is to learn what actually happens and to see like what people actually do, and that we're not committing to we're not testing this one solution to see if it works or not. We're trying to look at a range of things to kind of understand what people are really trying to accomplish and evolve our understanding of the problem and evolve our understanding of how different solution paths might work. So it really depends on the situation, but I hope, Jonathan, that little bit was useful.
All right, perfect. So it looks like we have a couple minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and close out today's webinar. Thank you again, Glenn, for participating and sharing your design thinking wisdom with us. If you guys could chat one thing that you learned in today's webinar in the chat box, it's always helpful for us to share that information with Glenn. Also, we have a post-event survey, so if you guys could take a couple extra minutes, your feedback really helps us dictate future content. So there's about 10 questions on there, so if you could share your feedback with us, it's always good for us to know. If you're on social media, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so feel free to give us a like, heart, and follow, I think is the order. We also post a lot of tips and tricks on our blog, so feel free to visit our blog at blog.techsoup.org. And just so you guys know, we have a couple more webinars coming up in the next few weeks. So on 7/26, we have a webinar on Build a Successful Monthly Giving Program. On 8/14, how to produce captivating digital content. And then on 8/21, 27 ways to immediately update your website. Again, we post all of our webinars on our website, so if you can't make those dates, feel free to check out the archives. And lastly, thank you again to Glenn. Thanks to Lashika for helping out on the back end, and we hope to see you guys at a future webinar.
Okay.